quite dramatic what followed those few years afterwards, as well as having kids. My dad started a business, and my parents started a new church with 2 or 3 other families when I was 3 years old. So I kind of grew up a little bit in this sort of environment, long before Antioch Network existed, because I'm quite old now. That church that became my sort of home church grew over it was a slow process. So by the time I was about 18, it had gone from being a church plant in someone's living room, like rotating living rooms, through to a place that had acquired an old school and was in the process of converting it into a church facility that eventually became like a proper church building with a cap centre and a community cafe and an auditorium and meeting spaces upstairs. And interestingly, what happened with that building was by the time they bought it, it was this really high ceiling thing, but they wanted to put a second floor in so they could have meeting space upstairs. So by that age, I was working on some building sites for my uncle. So I did some demolition work, and my job was to take a lump hammer and smash into the plasterboard, because the ceiling were once they put the floor in, the ceilings were slightly too low for that, so they needed to cut up into the rafters. And in order to do that, they had to bring down 100 years worth of dust from this old Victorian school roof and all this plaster stuff. And looking back, this is something like a metaphor for church planting. It's painful and quite unglamorous work. And it's only really in writing some stuff about this recently that I thought, actually, that's kind of, yeah, that sort of works. So just to track back a little bit to when I was 14, that year I got baptized, had quite a powerful experience of the Holy Spirit. Weirdly, when another youth group that we went to meet in Scarborough prayed for me and a lot of my friends, and lots of us really had an encounter with God, which sort of changed us. I think we were walking with Jesus, but I think this sort of intensified that a little bit, in some cases quite a lot. We had some other influences on us. A guy who prophesied some of us would end up going on some mission trips, and then within a few years, a bunch of us had gone off to different places, some places like Romania. I'd been on a couple of trips to Northern Ireland and South Africa. And then when at 18, I joined up with YWAM for their 5-month discipleship training school in West Africa, and which brought me back very excited. Couldn't stop talking about it, to the point when some of my mates called me Pete when I was in Africa. And so I had this sort of sense of like resonance for some reason with African Christianity. Didn't really know what to do with that. But I came back to the UK and went to Leicester to do a communications degree, which sounds totally unrelated, but then life is like that sometimes. So again, into my second year of my degree, I met Liz, who I'm now married to. Be 25 years this summer. Wow. And she's from Manchester, so when we first started dating, she basically said to me, if we're going to end up together long term, you're probably going to need to come to Manchester. And if you really feel called to go back to Africa in some capacity, I don't think I had that much to offer Africa, but anyway, but if you feel called to go and do something abroad or whatever, then actually we might not work out long term, because she had quite a sense that that's where God wanted her to go. And so anyway, so we carried on dating a little bit, and then she went to this Christian conference, and she had this real encounter with God. She had a vision in which her dad drove around a very specific housing estate in East Manchester called Openshaw. She had no idea what this sort of vision meant. She's never that type. She's not very Pentecostal in her sort of flavour of Christianity, if you will. But this was like a real moment with God. But she didn't know what to do with this kind of vision of being driven around Openshaw, until that same conference, a guy gets up from the Message Trust and says, well, there's this place in East Manchester called Openshaw. We're about to start an Eden team, right? Which eventually became a church planting team. And that's the shortest way I can summarise it. But why I'm sharing this story is because if you're trying to think about how you could help recruit a team in the future, or or something along those lines, then this is like how I joined one and how Liz joined one. So she has this encounter with God. She hears this guy going on about open shore. There's that click of like what she's seen in her spirit and what someone else is talking about that she didn't know until then what was going to happen. And she's like, right, I mean, this is it. I'm going for it. So she rings me, and I was a bit like, okay, not totally enthusiastic, if I'm really honest. I think a little bit of chauvinism, if I'm really, because she heard from God first, but then so did Mary with Joseph, so, you know, I had to sort of get over that.
Worked out all right.
Anyway, so I end up going to a different conference later on that year, completely different network, different denomination, really good time with God. The guy gets up, I want to tell you about a team that's starting in open shores, and like, okay, I'm beginning to get the feeling that this is like right for all of us. And so that's a little bit of my story, but I just want to share a few things that specifically I've learned from that experience. If in terms of recruiting a team, the first one is timing's really important, right? Yeah, you want to? Oh yes, please. Sorry. Oh, that's a little bit later, but it's fine. Leave it on. Time is really important. So I was at that transition point in my life when people are leaving sixth form and looking for something next. They're leaving university or they're in some other transition point. Also, if they're going into retirement, and I really want to make a point about that because those are times when people are often really thinking about what next. So there may be opportunities where you can connect with something, that you can network with someone, or you can go to some conference or something where you're particularly looking for people who are at those flex points in life, and not just where they're young, because what we had as a team, what became a church planting team in Openshore, had nobody except one couple who was over the age of like 30. So we got told, get some mentors. We went out, every single person we asked for a mentor, an older Christian who could guide us a little bit and give us some counsel and perspective and whatever. Every single one of them said, no, we're too busy, right? So if someone ever asks you in future at some point, please don't do that. It's so painful because you have to learn everything from scratch. Like, it's just really not helpful if there's nobody, if there's no Jethro to give your point, you can come alongside and say, look, that's fine, but what you're doing over here is not good. It's a bit blunt, but sometimes we need to hear it. And so I really recommend church planting teams look not just for students or people of a certain age, but also look for people who might be retired or going into retirement, who can act as mentors, wise counsel, and who can teach the other people to pace themselves. Because we just go so full pelt sometimes if we're in our 20s, for example. So timing is really important. Repeating the message is really crucial. It's really crucial. Sometimes people need to hear the gospel like multiple times before they become Christians, but I think it may also be the case that they need to hear the vision of a potential new church before they really get what's going on. Maybe that relates to what you were saying about from your story about thinking we should have a few people in here, and people just sometimes you just have to keep putting it out there and see what happens. People usually, though not always, need to feel called to join a team or something like that. So the great exception is Jackie Pullinger, brilliant missionary, left England, went to Hong Kong. She famously said she never felt called to the Walled City, called to Hong Kong. She felt sent because it's in Matthew 28, the Great Commission. So, and I don't want to take anything away from her story because it's really authentic. She's like my favourite missionary. It's fantastic. But I do think that's the exception rather than the rule. And if you're in a team and you feel like you've been called to join it, or somebody else is in your team and they feel called to join it, when the tough times come, and they will, they're more likely to stick with that team. You're more likely to stick, whoever it is, more likely to stick with the team and the vision. And that's really been kind of, my experience when things have been difficult and unglamorous, like smashing a lump hammer through a plaster for a few weeks. So, any questions? Because I've got a little bit more story to tell, but at this point, is that reasonably clear?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Good. So several of us have been on that original Eden team and then stayed in the community. in November 2013, we started a brand new church called Hope Community Church Manchester, which is confusing for Antioch because it's almost exactly the same as John and Janice's church name. But anyway, so it's nearly 10 years old, but about 2 years in, we've got through some real teething problems. And the bottom line is that church plant is tiring. We've talked a bit about this before with like becoming parents or other things that might happen. Some people get chronic pain syndrome, or they get a ME, or whatever it might be. Something happens and they just not got the same capacity as before. And so what we found was a lot of those people who we journeyed with for ages were just knackered. And to be honest, at least for a season, some of them needed to be in a bigger church where they come off rota a little bit and they just like receive a bit more from God and they're giving out a bit less, and then hopefully get the mojo back. And that happened with some friends of ours who actually never joined Hope Community Church. At that point when that was launched, they went and joined the local Anglican church, and it was so good for them. And they're now leading a church plant in Gorton, right? They're now the site leaders at CCM Gorton. But they just needed that time. And so I want to say that in the least judgmental way possible. Sometimes it's tiring. People just there needs to be a bit of a, and so that's what we found. And there were other people who were convinced that we had to have our own building, and we didn't have the money for a building. So they're like, right, we're off. And other people were like, well, we have to have a full-time paid pastor. We didn't have one of those either. So other people were like, right, we're off. And at the same time, I had this completely going the other way, this feeling that God was calling me to lead and to be the pastor of this fledgling church. And I was talking with my mentor, who's a Nigerian pastor, and he was saying, God placed you in here for a reason. There's no way I would have even pursued that if it weren't for him and his encouragement. And basically, we got to a point where, as we were wrestled as a leadership team of some of this stuff, I felt like God, we were reading loads of stuff about church leadership, all this different stuff, visions for church. And there was the three things that really stood out, which is reaching new people with the gospel, growing in Christian faith, and equipping leaders. And so that's what I put out there one Sunday, the beginning of this particular year. And then by Easter of that year, 2/3 of the congregation had left. Right? Not because it was a rubbish vision, because it's quite good, right? I didn't write it, so I'm not, I sort of borrowed it. But like Liz and I just felt like we were holding this baby, and there were other people where their priority was the building or the full-time pastor or the whatever or their tiredness. And so we just in the end said, look, we want to bless you if you're here and you want to stay and you feel that you'll want to own the vision with us. And if you want to go for whatever region, you feel God called you somewhere else, whatever, we want to bless you too in your going as well. So let's just put it out there and see what happens. And just to make that transition period even more painful, there was one final Sunday where pretty much everyone was still around, and somebody actually brought party poppers to the final service before 2/3 of the congregation left. It's the most insulting, unhelpful thing. It's so annoying. And there's others I can tell you which are not particularly helpful. But basically, the ones who left, they just owned it with us. It was really exciting. There was one guy, for example, who was always at the back, who was always doing tech. He ended up preaching. I asked him to do it once. And it's not particularly his gift, but his first preach was mint. I was waiting to give him constructive feedback. There wasn't any. It was just like, it's great. And in some ways, other people needed to move on in order that he was able to step out from almost from under someone else's shadow a little bit. And this goes back to your thing about blind spots. Sometimes you're just not looking in the right way. We may possibly not be looking in the right places. And then I invited a friend from York, which is where I grew up, to come over and live in Manchester, find a place, find a new job, join us. He did. That was also my mentor's idea, actually. And he's still with us now. He's one of our leaders. Liz made an effort at 2022 Jubilee Street Party we had. Ghanaian family joined us. 7 young people got baptised a year and a half ago, including our kids, Sam and Ruth, who are now 16 and 15, which is scary. And that was just such an amazing time. What was really interesting about that day, especially, was when those 7 young people got baptized, lots of the people that we'd had somewhat strained relationships with, who'd gone on to other things, were there at that service. And it just felt like something was healed. Where, because it's difficult, especially for the blokes. The wives, the women maintain relationships really well. But like for me and some of the other guys who'd been involved and some had gone on to different things, it was difficult for a while, and it just felt like something was healed, because in the end, the gospel is what matters. Like it just really is. And so it is difficult. You know, we've grown downwards, you know, by 2/3 about 10 years ago. We're now back up to about 300. That's ridiculous. I've just read something wrong in my notes. About 30 from 7 different countries, 5 African nations, and Northern Ireland and England. And we're just really grateful. And the church is frankly still a bit fragile. At times it feels like, you know, what are we doing? We've not got enough. We need a worship team. We don't really have a worship team. There's all sorts of practical things, but we're really seeing God at work, and hopefully there's some useful stuff. Let me just share a few team lessons that I think I've learned from this. It's to be clear about the vision and restate it at least once a year, which goes back to the earlier point about maybe if leadership team might have people be on it for a year, and then actually in terms of people who might call themselves members, would you own it? Would you be part of that for a year at least, which gives some sense of clarity? I think that's probably quite a healthy thing to do, something I felt reminded from you, Ben, earlier, to actually do at this sort of back end of this month, start of next. Giving people the opportunity to opt out as well as opt into the vision. Try not to take it personally when people want something else, even though sometimes it is a bit personal. And an old friend of mine said about a mutual person we knew, just, he doesn't inspire me. I just think, oh, that might be true of us. It might be the way we communicate or something we do that's like annoys them. Sometimes the person who opts in might surprise you. Work with who you do have and pray that God will develop new gifts in them. Don't always be looking for everybody else. Love people as they are and pray for them and let God do the growing. It's better to have a small but united team than a large but divided one. And then God's more, I didn't put this on the list, but I think God is more inclined to use a team powerfully, a church planting team or such like, if we're happy for him to get all the credit. I really think sometimes the Holy Spirit holds back on doing signs and wonders if people are going to be like, thank you. We've got it nailed. I think so. Maybe there's more miracles that we could be seeing if we had less of that. And so let me just finish on 1 Corinthians 3, 1-7. For when one says, I follow Paul, and another, I follow Apollos, are you not mere human beings? What after all is Apollos, and what is Paul? Only servants through whom you came to believe. As the Lord has assigned to each his task, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it, but God has been making it grow. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who makes things grow. So it's really, that's me. But any questions?
I think I've learned a lot about, the time for recruiting. Very powerful, when people are in transition. And I think you also answered the question about why some people leave in the lunch team and all that. Yeah, why they leave.
Yeah.
And then also, it's interesting that about how God can bring new people from the shadows.
Yeah.
When, that means that if you don't focus on those who've left, but look at those who are still with you, you could probably raise new leaders out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to, if you read carefully the story of the spies sent out into Israel, it's so interesting in that passage, because basically you've got 12, 10 of them come back saying, yeah, but there's loads of problems, and 2 of them come back saying something positive. And you can tell who the maturest of them is, because Caleb is like the teenage one, who's like, yeah, we can do it. And Joshua's just that little bit wiser, and he's like, if God is for us, then we can do this. This is great. This is land of promise. And I feel like there might be people in planting teams who are like your Caleb's, and they just need to be underneath a Joshua in that sense, because it can become cocky. But at the same time, there's something raw that God can use, especially if they've got a Joshua who's like, yeah, if the Lord's in this, we're on. I think that's just something to really watch out for, because it's not like a binary, they've been finished product, finished article, or they're useless in your planting team. It might be that there's like levels of just stepping up gradually and becoming a bit more mature and a bit less like swagger.
So how did you, in that painful season, Pete, of, taking on the leadership, people leaving, how did you keep going? Because there would have been a lot of people who would have been like,
yeah, absolutely. There was a time when, I probably, even now, probably once a month, I'm like, but there was a time when it was every week, really, and I think it was hugely down to my my mentor Ruben, who's a Nigerian pastor, has just done just planted loads of churches, including in overseeing several in the UK and planting one in York, which is kind of a tough place in some ways to start something new when you're from overseas. But interestingly, the fastest growing churches in the UK are all led by Australians and Africans and non-Brits. So, but yeah, it was difficult, and I think the other thing is I needed Liz with me in that. There's no way I could have done that if she was like, I'm really not up for this. And so we had to really be on point. I think that's probably harder for single people just to try and figure that out. But if you are in a relationship, you've got to both really sense that it's the right thing. And she, and Liz knows her own mind. So she would say if she really felt like this wasn't right, and I think it's got to be a joint thing, really. So hopefully that's been useful anyway.
Really good.
Right, I'm back to you.
Yeah, I was just struck by you talking about Caleb.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking people like people who see